So I will tell you an incident, a documented incident, which many of you have probably heard at some point or other. Is that too loud? Is that too loud? Is that good? As a fast daddy, and I don't want to scare people or wake them up. There's a documented incident. Many of you have heard me mention this in the past, but I always come back to it because of the Musar Haskell. A guy walked into an automobile dealership on a, I just trouble you to toss it, thanks. You have to give it back afterwards. A guy walked into an automobile dealership late Friday afternoon, and he bought a brand new car, a brand new Lexus for whatever it was, for $50,000. And he goes straight to a used car dealer, drives straight to a used car dealership, and he says to the guy, listen, I just bought this car for $50,000, I'll sell it to you for $20,000. Guy says to him, why would you want to sell a $50,000 car for $20,000? He says, don't ask questions, you make quick 30,000 bucks. Guy says, I don't know, I think about it. Goes into the back room, he calls the police. Says, you better send somebody down here, got a funny situation. Cop comes down, he says to the guy, tells him the situation. Says to the guy, why do you want to sell a $50,000 car for $20,000? Guy smiles sweetly at the cop, he says, it's none of your business. Policemen don't like that. Trust me, from personal experience. So, cop says to him, well, I'm going to make it my business, let me have your credit card. He takes his credit card, and he calls the company. It's late Friday afternoon, company's closed for the weekend. Says to the guy, okay, I'm going to have to lock you up over the weekend. Monday morning, we'll find out what's doing. Locks him up. Monday morning, he calls the credit card company. Sure enough, everything's in order. He's got a credit line, no problem. Card's in order, it's all his. Terrific. Cop comes back to the guy, says, sorry, my mistake, you're free to go. The guy smiles sweetly at the cop again. He says, thank you very much. He goes straight to an attorney's office and he files a lawsuit against the police department for false arrest. He had planned the entire escapade, start to finish, to do something that looks questionable. Certainly suspicious that you sell a $50,000 car for $20,000 the minute you bought it. He purposely did it on the weekend when he knew the credit card company would be closed for the weekend and he would get maximum lockup time in prison over Saturday and Sunday, and then in court he'd be able to plead emotional trauma and distress, which he did, and he got a settlement of $3.5 million. Documented in a sefer by Rabbi Zilberstein, Shlita. So there's a Musar Haskell. When I told my wife the story the first time, she said to me, well, who would think of something like that? I said, well, millionaires, that's who, and that's why we're not, because we didn't think of it. So, yeah, shame, ain't it? So, $3.5 million. Now, if somebody would ask you, how much was the car worth? Was the car worth $50,000? The car worth $20,000? The car is worth $3.5 million. Okay, you can't do it, Genevas das, this, that, and the other. At the end of the day, the Musar Haskell is, and this is what Rabbi Zilberstein brings out, that there are certain things in life that have a hidden value. We don't understand the value. We think we know what something is worth, and very often the value is beyond our comprehension. Number one on the list is Talmud Torah. Talmud Torah keneged kulam, and it's the most difficult mitzvah for us to understand how it is that a person could sit in a base medrash and learn about, learn about migus and chazakas, and somehow he's keeping the world going. And the value is often, it's beyond our kind, even we who are doing it all day, or as much as we can, I don't think to truly appreciate what a word of Torah is, what the ultimate value of Torah is, what it does in this world, what it does in the other worlds. And it's difficult, but the Musar Haskell is that there are things that we don't appreciate their value. One of those is the idea of teaching Torah to others. Now, officially, the term outreach, they call it Kiruv Rechokim, which is how it is referred to. What I have always referred to it as, and I've been here over 30 years. They have not made a Baal Tshuva out of me yet. But I've been here over 30 years, and still I refer to it as education for those who are the uninitiated, because that's really what we're doing. It's education. We are educating, whether we're educating over a text or we're educating by inviting them into a home for Shabbos and showing them what a Shabbos table is, or we're educating through our own personal example, but ultimately we're engaged in education. We're educating those who don't know. Chazal, the Gemara says, above B'tzia, the Gemara says, Kol ha'malamed es ben am ha'aretz Torah, somebody who teaches Torah to the son of an am ha'aretz, afilu HaKadosh Baruch Hu gozer gzeira mevatla bishvilo. That a person who teaches Torah to ben am ha'aretz, to somebody who has not had an opportunity to study Torah, so even if there is a decree against Klal Yisrael, HaKadosh Baruch Hu mevatel the decree of the merit of that person who's teaching him Torah. So could you imagine, you have a chavrusa, you have somebody you invite into your house and you learn a piece of chumash with them, a pasuk from the Torah, you teach them what parshas a shavua is, you have a chavrusa, a tutor, a mentor, whatever it is, and you teach somebody a little bit of Torah. What are we accomplishing? So he taught him a piece of Torah. How much are we accomplishing? The answer is, Chazal say, that a person, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a gzeira chas v'shalom against Klal Yisrael, that person is teaching Torah to somebody who's uneducated. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is mevatel the gzeira for them. So it has to always be kept in mind that when a person is engaged in what we call outreach, and the outreach that when people say the word Kiruv and outreach, are always thinking about, some deep philosophical discussion about whether or not the world exploded into a perfect order. I don't know about that one. If my grandchildren have been in the house for 10 minutes, somehow the house never explodes into a better order than it was before. Otherwise I wouldn't be locking certain doors. So I'm not sure about that svara, or whether or not we come from gorillas. The Medrash says that at Migdal Bavel, HaKadosh Baruch Hu took 1/3 of the people and turned them back into monkeys. He turned people to monkeys. He didn't turn monkeys into people. And until, so there have never been people, there are nowadays people who seem to be turning into monkeys. You check the Supreme Court or other places, there are certainly evidence of that phenomenon. But at the end of the day, based on, I'm just judging based on some of their rulings. At the end of the day, the idea of Kiruv as a discussion, and I'll talk you into it, and so on and so forth. The best approach to Kiruv, the best approach to anything, is to study Torah. Chazal say, "Ha'or shebo yachziren al mutav." The light of Torah brings people back, and we've seen that over and over over the course of the years. That a young man who gets involved, especially in Gemara learning, creates a certain magnet that draws a person to commitment. Why, how it works, why it works, I have no idea, I don't really care. I only know that it does, and I've seen it over and over and over, that it's the Torah learning itself, along with a few other factors we'll speak about, Ezer Hashem, but it's the Torah learning itself which draws a person in, and the person who is teaching the Torah is protecting Klal Yisrael from Gzeros. That is what Chazal say. Number 2, there's the mitzvah of halachta b'drachav. Halachta b'drachav means we have to emulate HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We have to try as much as possible. Just as HaKadosh Baruch Hu is merciful, we have to be merciful. HaKadosh Baruch Hu visits the sick, we should visit the sick, and so on and so forth. One of the ways we emulate HaKadosh Baruch Hu is by teaching Torah, because it says HaKadosh Baruch Hu is hamalamed Torah le'amo Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu teaches Torah to Klal Yisrael. A person who's teaching Torah to somebody else, so then what he is doing is he's actually emulating HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A person is following, is walking in the ways of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we have to know that the first and most important job for anybody who is involved in Kiruv, involved in outreach, and wants to bring people closer, is that they have to know that they're getting involved in Torah education, and they are following in the path of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They're preventing and saving Klal Yisrael from harsh gezeros. Number 1. Number 2, we have to realize what the generation is, where people are coming from. So Baruch Hashem, nowadays we are seeing people who have had a little bit. It used to be in the early days before in Chutz La'aretz. Now there are many outreach organizations. It used to be that people would come into Ohr Somayach, they're sight unseen. They had never ever encountered a frum Jew. Nowadays things have changed. The map has changed a little bit, where there's much more outreach in many American cities, cities in Europe. There are organizations that are already doing. Some people often come here, they've already had a taste, and now they're coming here in order to continue the process. You have to understand that we're in a door where obviously the values of the door are distorted, and they're just beyond what anybody would have dreamed. The world is beyond what anybody would have dreamed 20 years ago about what is okay. Everything that's terrible is good, and everything that's proper is horrific, and everything is backwards and upside down. But there are people who are completely, they're still ad hayom, people who are completely clueless, and a person never knows what it is that is going to bring a person back. I met a young man, and this was a young man from a frum home, and by the way, that's included in outreach, as nowadays they're what they call kids at risk, or kids who are off the derech, or whatever expression they use. That is also a form of Torah education that is necessary, and how to educate is also vital, because sometimes it's because they've had some sort of education, and that's where the way they are. I had a young man who told me he was sitting on his bed smoking a cigarette and drinking a Pepsi at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and the door of his yeshiva, he was in a yeshiva for kids who were struggling, the door of his yeshiva opened, and the mashgiach of the yeshiva walked in at about 5 in the afternoon. He was wearing a talis and a kittel. He says to this young man from home, no, we don't smoke and drink now. Now it's Yom Kippur. We're about to start saying Kol Nidre. The kid's schedule at the time had been he would sleep all day and he would run around either on beaches or partying at night. Rosh Hashanah had come and gone, and he would never knew it. He never knew there had been a Rosh Hashanah because he slept during the day. And this is the first time that he is finding out that it's now Yom Kippur. He told me this story when he had already come to a mainstream yeshiva and eventually got married, was learning in kollel, was raising a Torah family. But there are people who are clueless. There are people in our society who are completely unaware, and it becomes our job to try to find them, contact them, and educate them. When I was learning in this yeshiva myself back in the former Beis Medrash, so I was sitting in my seat, and one of the members of the Hanhala today, who was also a Talmud in the yeshiva at the time, he came over to me and he asked me if I would be interested in joining a group of guys going to play a basketball game against the Israeli Air Force. There was a Kiruv program at the time. The Ohr Somayach had certain interaction with the Air Force. Pilots were coming to Ohr Somayach and becoming depiloted. Eventually, the Air Force, there was a lot of one-way traffic, so the military put an end to the program. But he asked me if I would be interested to go to play a basketball game against the Israeli Air Force. Now look, I was in the middle of learning, and it was difficult to rip myself away from my Gemara, but what I wouldn't do for the cause. So we had to take our passports because we were going on to an Israeli Air Force base, which was an Israeli Air Force base, top security, this and that. They even brought us a military jeep, and they drove us down to the Air Force. And the goal was to show these Israelis that not only we can tap them in the spiritual realm, but we can tap them in the physical realm as well. That the yeshiva guys aren't just a bunch of turtles in a shell. And that was the goal. There was also a program on the military base where they were educating them, but that was the goal. And so we went down there. I remember it was a rough game. We were American finesse ball players, and they were Israelis. And I think it's the only time in my life I was fouled shooting a free throw. And we gave a good performance, and unfortunately we lost. And at the end of the game, we had a meeting with the commander of the entire base, the Israeli base. Now, they were going back, Rabbi, were going back many years. I met this man for about 10 minutes. He gave us a quick course how to fly an F-15, a crash course on how to fly an F-15. I met the man for about 10 minutes. I still remember what he looks like. He's one of the most impressive individuals I ever loved, which you hope for, somebody running an Israeli Air Force base. And he had that rare combination of confidence, humility, and arrogance all rolled up into one. And then he told us something remarkable. He said a pilot flying an F-15, flying twice the speed of sound, often you fly out over the horizon and he experiences vertigo. And he doesn't know which way is up or down. The sky is blue, the water is blue, and they're educated, they're taught. They have an indicator on the panel, and they have to put full confidence in the indicator. If the indicator says pull it up, you have to pull it up, down, and you have to completely neglect your own instincts, otherwise you crash the plane. You have to put full confidence into that indicator. So on the way back to the yeshiva, we were speaking about what this pilot, what he told us. We realized that it was a perfect metaphor for the world today, where you have most of the world is hurtling through life at twice the speed of sound with no direction, no indication of what's up or down, right or wrong. And there's only one small group of people, which is Klal Yisrael, that has an indicator called the Torah. And we have to put our full confidence into the Torah for direction. So that's the world that we're dealing with today. And a person has to know that our job is to then help and impart values and educate those who don't know and have never been exposed to teach them what Torah actually is. There was a young man who, in California, who was at a very, very upscale private school, a Catholic school in California, a Jewish kid, apparently brilliant guy. And one day, somebody taps him on the shoulder, and he said to him, Bishop Garver wants to speak to you in the office. Bishop Garver was the principal of this Catholic school. He said, Bishop Garver wants to speak to you in the office. So Goldstein walks into the office, and he sits down, and Bishop Garver says to him, Goldstein, what's the difference between Maimonides and Nachmanides? So he looked at him like he said, I'd never heard of Maimonides, never heard of Nachmanides, never heard of, he said, I have no idea. So Bishop Garver reaches into his drawer, he pulls out a translation of the Ramban in English, and he shows it to me. He says, Goldstein, this is good stuff. You don't know what you're missing. Go back to your people. He told me he had no idea what just happened. So one thing, to make a short story long, one thing led to the other, and he eventually ended up by the New Square Hasidim, after obviously by the Rabbi from New Square. That's where he started becoming from, and then from there he went to Ner Yisrael in Baltimore, where he got smicha. And he told me when he got married, they were sitting at the head table, Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, Zatzal, the Rosh Shiva of Ner Yisrael, and the Square Rebbe was there at the head, and Bishop Garver. The three of them were at the head table. He said Bishop Garver had more nachas than anybody, and he got married. And today he became a Rav, he became a major force in Torah outreach and education. So what we want to do is we want to communicate to people the beauty of Torah. There's a beauty of a Torah life. There's a beauty of learning Torah. There's the geschmack of learning Torah. And what we want to show people, and this is the message that has to be communicated, you've probably come to this on your own or you've heard it from others. What we realize, so the mistake that we make and the mistake that people make looking in at a Torah world, people think that the Frum have made some sort of deal with the Ribono Shalom where we'll be getting some sort of abstract spiritual reward in the world to come. In exchange, we will give up any of the pleasures of this world. That's the perception. The perception is that the Haredi ultra-Orthodox stone throwers have given up any sort of pleasure and enjoyment in this world, and that's in exchange for something down the future, their future considerations, which is the biggest mistake. What we want to show people is that Torah involves not only the idea of preparation for the eternity. Torah is a way of life in this world which provides us with a content, fulfilling, whatever word you want to use, a fulfilling way of life over here. And we want to show people a Shabbos table. We want to show people what a Torah family looks like. We want to show people what a healthy marriage looks like, which is something so lacking today. If a young lady could say to her friend, I once read at someone in Reader's Digest, a young lady says to her friend, when I go out with a guy, I ask myself, is this the man I want my children to spend every other weekend with? And if that's the state of affairs in the world today, and we want to show people, there are alternatives to that. There are alternatives. That's not the way it has to be. And what we're trying to show people is the beauty and demonstrate the beauty of Torah to people who are living. It used to be searchers, people back in the 70s, people were looking for a philosophical explanation, and then later on they started looking for a little bit of fulfillment. Today people are looking for normalcy. That's all it is, just normalcy. That's all you have to show them. We can be normal, we can be healthy, a healthy approach to life, and that's what we're looking to introduce people to. Now, Chazal say, Tein lo mishalo, She'ata v'shalach shelo. Mishnah Pirkei Avos says, give HaKadosh Baruch Hu that which comes from Him, because you and yours are His. So Chazal say, Ten lo mishalo she'ata v'shalach shelo. The idea here is that every single person in this Beis Medrash has talents and has skills, has abilities and capabilities. Every single person has various. A person says, well, I'm not necessarily a teacher, I'm nervous when I talk to people, I'm nervous, I don't know what to say, how do you answer, what if he asks me this question, that question. There isn't a person in this base medrash who has not got abilities that Rishbon Shem have given that can be used in furthering the cause of Torah education and Kiruv. If a person is not necessarily a teacher, a person could be an administrator. If a person is not, could be an organizer. A person could certainly be a fundraiser. Right? There are endless areas where a person can put his various talents to use in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in furthering Torah education. Somebody may have communication skills. Communication skills does not have to be in front of in a classroom. A communication skills just knowing how to speak to somebody, how to invite somebody to the Shabbos table and make him comfortable. And by the way, just derech agav, one of the common mistakes people make if they invite a college student or somebody to home for Shabbos, one of the mistakes is to then get engaged in all these philosophical discussions. That's a mistake. The most important thing that one can do inviting somebody into their home for Shabbos is show them how a Torah family works on Shabbos. That to them is an eye-opener. For a person to see what a Shabbos looks like, that's not the time to discuss about all the profound questions they have. There's time for that. To come to a Shabbos table and to see how a husband and wife interact, how parents interact with kids, with children, with teenagers, how, you sing Zmiris around the table, that they should just sense the family. Rav Meir Schuster's once picked up a guy at the Kaisel back in the day when you were allowed to, it was always problematic for men to approach women was always problematic. Nowadays it's probably problematic to approach men. But in those days, you could still do it. And he tapped the guy on the shoulder, and his young man, his name was Timothy Ridgway. And it turned out that Timothy Ridgway was Jewish. And Rabbi Schuster asked him if he'd like to experience a traditional Friday night meal. He said, how much? How much did it cost? I told you he was Jewish. And he said, no, it's free. And he brought him to the Shabbos table. He said, I'll pick you up in a couple hours. He came back a couple hours later and said to him, how was that? He says, hey, that was great. That's like having Christmas once a week. Because in his mind, that was it. Once a year was when the family got together. And then somebody has shown that a Torah family, once a week for 24 hours, 3 times in 24 over the course of 24 hours, a family sits at a table and communicates. Something almost unheard of in the world at large. And so a person to show what the beauty of a Torah of a world is. And to make that Shabbos table a time to answer questions and discussions of philosophy, which is often a mistake. Let the education be, this is a Torah home. And the guys walk in, sometimes they walk into their home, they're a bit overwhelmed. Because they take a look and they say, well, wow, there are 9 kids here. He's never seen 9 children in one place at one time. Last time he saw that was in 4th grade, and all of a sudden he walks in and he sees there are 9 children, and then they say to him, yeah, we're waiting for the other 7, they're coming soon. They're just at a friend's house. So, they walk into a Torah home and they see, whoa, this is something they've never seen. It's an education, and it's that education, that's what our job is. Now, most important of all, in my opinion, my experience, is not what you say. Much more important than what you say is how you say it, that's for sure. How you say it. Even saying, I don't know, pleasantly is much better than proving to somebody that he's wrong about his funny ideas about life. But more important than that is how a person comes across as a representative, as a Torah Jew. Chazal say, the Torah says, Avram Avinu, he went down to Mitzrayim. When Avram Avinu came back, so the Gemara says, Rashi brings down in Parshas Lech Lecha, that Avram Avinu came back from Mitzrayim. He stayed at the same hostels that he had stayed at on the way down to Mitzrayim. So Rashi brings down 2 perushim. We learned over here derech eretz. Number 1, that Shelo Yashana Me'achsan Yashal, a person should not change his host. And Avram Avinu, when he went down to Mitzrayim, he stayed by certain hostels or certain hotels or motels, whatever they were. On the way back from Mitzrayim, he stayed at the same places. He was hosted by the same people. Then Rashi says he had to pay off, he brings another parish, Rashi says he had to pay off his debts. Now, ostensibly what Rashi means when he says he had to pay off his debts is that when Avram Avinu went down to Mitzrayim, he was penniless. And he goes down to Mitzrayim and he comes with his whole entourage, and there's a hotel or a motel. And the guy says, could you put us up over here? Do you mind if we stay here? Sure. Is it okay if I pay you on my way back from Mitzrayim? Now, if you were the owner of the hotel and Avram Avinu was coming down to Mitzrayim and he's penniless and he's on his way to Egypt, what are the chances that a person would be willing to look at an Avram, look at him and say, yeah, sure, just put it on the tab. We'll see you on the flip-flop. When you come back from Mitzrayim, there he goes with a beautiful wife. In those days, statistically, if you went to Mitzrayim with a beautiful wife, it was a one-way trip. And so here he's going down, and on the way back, you're good for the money. So I saw one of the Bali boosters says, so why did they allow Avram to put it on credit? Obviously they did, because he had to pay off his debts. The answer is that when the host at the hotel saw an Avram Avinu, he took one look at Avram Avinu and said, this guy's good for the money. The impression he makes, I could trust him. There's certain people in life that you've met, you will meet, I'm sure you've met, certain people I've met, where at the first meeting, I can meet a person, and the first thought that goes through my mind is, no matter what happens, I will never lend this guy money. That's my first thought. Then we can now introduce ourselves. Avram Avinu comes into a hotel and he's willing to put him up, give him credit. Why? Because he creates a certain impression. That's an Avram Avinu. There's a certain impression that says, yeah, this guy could rely on. In Chicago, accentless Chicago, where I was born and raised, and never developed an accent of any sort. And by the way, studies have shown the most correct form of spoken English is the Midwest accent from Chicago. Studies were conducted in Chicago. There was a young man, a young yeshiva guy, it was Bein Zmanim, and he and some buddies wanted to rent some sort of one of these, what do you call those vehicles, the sports utility vehicle, some sort of vehicle for whatever it is, what we call dangerous. And they went to rent one of these vehicles, and they went into, it was like a rent there was in some little hick town outside of Chicago. So the guy goes in, and he says to him he needs 2 pieces of identification besides the deposit, whatever it was, a credit card needs 2 pieces of identification. He said, I'm sorry, I only have 1. So this guy, kind of rednecky guy, he looks at him, he says, roll up your sleeve. I said, what? He says, roll up your sleeve. So he rolls back his sleeve, and the guy looks, and he still had his tefillin marks on his arm. He says, oh, you got them marks on your arm. I'll rent it to you without the second card identification. How do you like that? So why he had tefillin marks on his arm at 4 in the afternoon, I don't know, because he got up late that day, but okay. At the end of the day, the story could have ended differently, by the way. Just imagine if you would have said, roll up your sleeves. Oh, you got those marks there. Forget about it. The last time I had a guy like you, I ended up getting sued, and he ended up taking 3 of my cards. Forget it. Could have gone in a different direction. That's our job. Our job is to create that impression by people. And I'm not talking about the non-Jewish world. And there's a very big mistake people make every time a Jew does something good and a non-Jew is impressed, people start shouting, Kiddush Hashem, Kiddush Hashem. The biggest Kiddush Hashem is for a man to get the Shachris on time before Yishtabach. That's a Kiddush Hashem. And if he gets there before Psukei de Zimra, that's a bigger Kiddush Hashem. If he actually says Korbanos, all right, well, let's not get into science fiction now, but that's the Kiddush Hashem is among Jews. Kiddush Hashem is among Jews. We're not worried about what the others think of us as much as we have to represent Torah based on the force of our personality, that people should see this is a Torah Jew. Because I'll say, Shem Shemayim Yisayiv Al Yodcha, that people should see you, and as a result of your behavior, Shem Shemayim should become beloved. The challenge that we have is that when we are confronted, and it happens very often that we're confronted if we are obviously religious looking, and sometimes people, they're looking to try to get a rise out of us. Lama atem lo hochim latzava, or lama atem kacha, v'lama zorkim avadim, all these challenges. And it's at that moment that a person has an opportunity to make a Kiddush Hashem, the real Kiddush Hashem. Whenever I'm confronted, it's happened quite a few, as it's happened to just about anybody living in Israel. That's part of the fun. Certain things happen when you're living in Israel. When you're living in Israel, you get to bus stops and buses pull away just as you get there, right? And when you live in Israel, you have to try finding addresses in Sanhedrin Morchevet. And these are all part of the challenges of living in Israel. And sometimes the challenge is being assaulted verbally by others simply because on the strength of how we're dressed or how we're looked in a liberal democratic country. And it's at that moment that we're able to diffuse and shatter the stereotypes by showing that we're not troubled by it, we're not bothered, and instead of fighting and arguing, we invite or we respond pleasantly. That becomes a way of showing what a Torah person is. There's actually a documented incident, Rav Yitzchak Zilberstein, a young man who was doing Kiruv in the south of Israel. And this is a shaila that came to Rav Zilberstein. A young man was doing Kiruv in the south of Israel, and it was near, what do you call it, one of those Jewish towns near Gaza, and a missile was shot, and the siren sounded. So he took his car, he drove his car off the side of the road to try to head for some sort of shelter. And as he drove his car off the side of the road, he killed a dog. And he ran into the shelter. When he came out of the shelter, he was confronted by the family of the dog. They said to him, you charedim, you don't care about animals, and you just drove off recklessly and you killed the dog intentionally. He said, listen, I apologize. There was a siren. I was trying to save my life. I didn't realize, I wasn't aware. And they started verbally assaulting him. And instead of getting upset, he was very apologetic. And the way it works in Israel is you yell at somebody, you apologize, and they invite you up for a cup of coffee. That's the way it always is. Bo. Yeah, and so he goes up to, that's how it is. It always ends with a Shabbos invitation. So they invited him up for a cup of coffee. He started speaking to his family, a very, very wealthy family. And he was sitting in their living room. And the next week when he went back down south, they invited him back again. And it's continued, and eventually the entire family became frum. And they said that we're so impressed by what you're doing, your outreach work. And they had some sort of massive mansion that they lived in, and they had a very huge, just a huge living room. They said, we want to make this room into a base medrash, and this will be your headquarters for your Kiruv operations. And they made a base shul that he could use as his home base in the south. They said, we only have one condition. We want to name the shul after the dog. And we want to, in honor of the dog's name was Igor, we want to call it Base Igor, right? This is a documented shaila. I have a pretty vivid imagination. I couldn't make this one up if I wanted to. They went to Rav Zilberstein, and they asked Rav Zilberstein, can you name a base medrash after a dog? So Zilberstein quoted the Gemara in Yuma Daf Test that mentions Rav Yochanan ben Turta as one of the Tanoim. And the Medrash says a turta in Hebrew is an axe. How did he become Rabbi Yochanan ben Turta? Because when he was not Jewish, he had sold, there was a Jew, and a Jew sold him an axe, the Medrash says. And this axe was used to not working on Shabbos because a Jew's animal is not allowed to work. So the guy bought the axe, and the axe refused to work on Shabbos. So he came back to the Jew, and he said to him, hey, listen, I bought a 7-day axe. This is a 6-day axe. This is not fair. So the Jew went over to the axe. He said, listen, when you were by me, Shabbos was a day off. Now you're by him, you got to work, bro. Right? So the ox apparently cooperated, and the ox started working. And this guy was so impressed that he converted, and he became a Tana of Yochanan ben Turta. And Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein said, if you could name a Tana in honor of an ox, you can name a Beis Medrash after the dog. So there is a Beis Medrash somewhere in Eretz Yisrael in the south called Beis Igor. All of which came about as a result of a Torah Jew behaving as a Torah Jew. His entire operation took a step forward, all because a Torah Jew behaved as a Torah Jew and represented Torah responsibly. And that's where there was another shaila that a kid who had a dog, his dog died, and he asked Rav Zilberstein if he could learn Mishnayos Le'ilui Nishmas HaDog. And that Rav Zilberstein said, no, we don't, one Mishnah starts with a Dalet, and then another one with a Vav, and then a Gimel, He said, no, that we don't do. You can't learn Mishnayos Le'ilui Nishmas HaDog. But if a person represents Torah, comes across as a Torah Jew, as a normal human being, then he has fulfilled his obligation of representing Torah properly. At the Chet HaEgel, Moshe Rabbeinu says to Yeshua, they're coming down from the mountain. And Moshe Rabbeinu says to Yeshua that there's noise. And Yeshua says to Moshe Rabbeinu, it sounds like the noise of the victor. So there's noise called the people are making noise in the Machane. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, that's not the noise of people who have emerged victorious. That's not the noise of people who have become defeated. That's simply noise. That's a ruckus. That's a tumult of people who are tummuling. And one of the Farshim says that what's going on, the Egel obviously is supposed to be a lesson that we take with us everywhere. The lesson of the Egel is that our society makes a lot of noise. And a lot of things are presented with noise. A person walks into certain places, there's always music, loud music in the background to drum out any sort of rational thought. Tremendous amount of noise is made over various pursuits, whether it's the accumulation of money or whether it's trying to become rich and famous and whatever it is. A lot of noise is made which blocks out rational thought. Torah is not presented with noise. Torah is presented as a very, very clear, calm discussion of what's really happening in life. And I'm often asked, and I think this is one of the key points that people have to understand, the Torah is not ours to negotiate, compromise, or trade. We can't make deals with the Torah. The extension of that's where Rabbi Yeshivat always said that we are not, the Torah is not ours to go making deals, to make a compromise and trade in. We don't do that. The Torah is that we have rules, and we have to play by the rules. I'm often asked on a regular basis, what do I say to somebody who asks me this, or what do I say to somebody who asks me that? There seems to be a perception that there are certain tricks that we could resort to, and if you say the right thing, so a guy will just, rip off his t-shirt and put on a bekisha and make a commitment, I'm from. It doesn't work that way. And number one. Number two, the answer to what we tell people, somebody asks me recently, what do I say to somebody who asks me why we wear payas? Why we're not allowed to cut the sides of it, to shave down the sides of our head? Why? What do I say to somebody? I said, why don't you say the truth? Tell them the truth. What is the truth? I said, okay, so it's not a question of what we say to other people, the question we ourselves, I don't know what is the truth. Now, we don't necessarily have to say everything. And if you're trying to engage somebody in a discussion, I wouldn't start off with the Seir LaAzazel as the first Dvar Torah I would tell to somebody, the uninitiated. I wouldn't talk about Mechias HaMolek right off the bat, or Yefas Torah. That doesn't have to start over there. But if somebody asks us a question, is it true that you have to annihilate Amalek? No, they're asking the question, we have to give an answer. And the answer is, there is such a command in the Torah. It has to be understood. And when does the command apply? Why does the command apply? Under what circumstances? And what has Amalek done? And so on and so forth. But we're not allowed to distort it, and we're not allowed to make stories up, because it's not our way. We have to present Torah accurately. So if a person is asked a question, then a person has to know that has to be answered accurately, number one. And number two, we can't bend any rules. There's the big shaila, everybody has to ask their own Rav, but we have our approach about, can I invite somebody if they're going to drive to my house for Shabbos? That's a famous question that people avoid. Am I allowed to invite somebody to my house if I know they're going to drive and they're going to be Mechal Shabbos? Rabbi Yashiv used to say, isn't it ridiculous to think that you're going to teach somebody Shmira Shabbos by having them be Mechal Shabbos? And there are all sorts of rationalizations. Yeah, but they're going to drive anyway, they're going to do this and that. And you have to ask a posek. I'm not telling you what the halach is. I'm just telling you, using this as an example of an area where one has to know, we can't go and start tampering with the rules. We have to know there are rules of Torah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us. And the Torah is not ours to negotiate. We don't deserve, we've never used an attitude of the means justify the ends. We don't do that, or the ends justify the means, however it works. The means have to be kosher, the ends have to be kosher, and everything has to be kosher. And therefore, that is the way that we are meant, that is the way that we're meant to present Torah. Finally, it's going to be a quick final here. Finally, what do you call it? We're always asked, we are commonly asked, what is the success rate at Ohr Somayach? What is the Ohr Somayach success rate in Kiruv? And the answer, surprisingly, is 100%. There's a 100% success rate at Ohr Somayach. Yeah, honestly, 100%. And the reason there's a 100% success rate is that Moshe Feinstein writes, and I suggest everybody look it up in the Drash Moshe, in Parsha Shlach, Perek Yudalid, Perek Chavdalid, Posek Yudalid, when Kalev ben Yefuneh is given a reward, the reward that Kalev ben Yefuneh is given is not, Rabbi Moshe says, not for the effort. Because if you look at what Kalev ben Yefuneh did, he tried to convince Klal Yisrael that we'll be okay, we could go into Eretz Yisrael. And in the end, they didn't. In the end, everybody cried, and there was a gzeira of 40 years in the desert. And Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says that Kalev ben Yefuneh did not get rewarded for his effort. Rabbi Moshe says Kalev ben Yefuneh in the Drash Moshe, he was rewarded for a concrete, tangible accomplishment. And his concrete, tangible accomplishment was that at the moment that he spoke, and he said, against the Meraglim said, it's not doable, and Kalev said, it is doable. At that moment, there were Hehurei Tshuva in Klal Yisrael. And those who were Meharher Tshuva, because it was wrong to go up against the word of Hashem, those who were Meharher Tshuva, who at a moment, for one moment, they felt we really shouldn't be thinking this way, at that moment was a concrete, tangible accomplishment, what Rav Moshe Feinstein calls Chaye Shah of the Nefesh. A person comes into Ohr Somayach, or a person comes to your Shabbos home, or a person sits and talks to you and learns one pasuk in Chumash, that's a success. It's 100% success. Do 100% of the people who come to Ohr Somayach become Shomer Shabbos? Probably eventually. So far I haven't seen it yet, but eventually they will. But that's not necessarily the measure of success. The measure of success is that a person has been exposed to Torah, authentic Torah, there's been an effect on the neshama, and that our job is to present Torah properly, do what we can do, and then a person who does, engages properly, will be zocheh to the siyata d'shmaya, that there should be concrete, tangible peros that we can see, and then there will be, for the person who makes the effort of involving himself and educating the uninitiated, besides the perosayim and olam hazeh, there are keren k'amsal olam haba.